All right, this is another session of accurately handling the word of truth. Study in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14. Currently, we are on 1 Corinthians 14. I'm going to try to chew my way through verses 19 through 21. Verse 19 says this, "Yet in the church I had rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that by my voice I might teach others also, than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue." Now, to review a little bit and to talk a little bit about the structure of this chapter, way back in verse 6, Paul says, he just comes with this statement that says that if I come to you speaking with tongues, okay, and many people have felt that way back there in verse 6 that Paul was just talking about some kind of hypothetical example that he made up out of his mind. Whereas I have felt that this chapter makes a lot more sense if we're not talking hypothetical, but we're talking about Paul is writing in the whole book of 1 Corinthians. He's responding to a letter that they sent to him. And in that letter, I believe, they said, we want you to come back to Corinth and speak in tongues to us. Now that sounds like a real ridiculous thing to do, and when we get to verse 20, we'll find out that Paul says that that's very childish too. But they had their reasons for doing that. It wasn't just out of the clear blue sky. In verse 6, Paul is saying, if I come and speak in tongues with you, I will not do so unless I can speak to you by revelation, by knowledge, by prophesying, and by doctrine as well. Then he goes, if you look in your Bibles, you'll find that he goes into a 13-verse digression, explaining to them something about the nature and purpose of tongues. They thought they had their purposes for speaking in tongues. Paul is saying, here's the real purposes for speaking in tongues. Takes 13 verses to do so, and in those verses, the summary of those verses is this: all sounds, words, and languages that are intended to communicate meaning to the hearers must either be clearly understood by the hearers or clearly interpreted to the hearers. Okay? He talks about musical instruments. If they play just one note over and over and over again, nobody's going to get the message. He's talking about military trumpets. In that situation, he's talking about words that one person knows but the other person doesn't know. Then he talks about languages, and the result of that is if they are not clearly understood, it will result in the hearers being, number one, confused, and number two, being offended with the speaker. The one who is making the sounds is going to offend or confuse the hearers. That's the sum total of what is being said for 13 verses in different scenarios that he gives. Which brings us to verse 19, where we are today, where he says, this is the last summary verse in his conclusion. He started out saying, if I come to you speaking with tongues, I'm going to speak to you in language you can understand as well. I'm not just going to give you a profusion of ununderstandable sounds. And then in this verse he says, "Yet in the church I had rather speak 5 words with my understanding. By my voice I might teach others than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue." This is the conclusion of their proposal. They said, "You come and speak with tongues to us because we're going to find out some things about you if you speak in tongues to us." We'll get to the wacky reasons here in just these next few verses that we're going to talk about. But right now, he is saying the conclusion of this whole digression of telling you what tongues is really for, what needs to be done in order for it to be edifying in the church, this is the conclusion. I had rather speak 5 words with my understanding. In other words, I'm going to speak with my understanding instead of deluge you with a whole bunch of tongue speaking in there. So, yet is the first word in there, and that means on the contrary. On the contrary, getting that up here, ties in with verse 18 where he drops this bomb on the Corinthians that he's writing to. He says, I speak in tongues more than all of you. He just drops it on. And this is the follow-up thing. He says, I speak in tongues more than all of you. I could speak 10,000 words in tongues easily to you. Without us breaking a sweat, I could speak 10,000 words. But on the contrary, if I come to you, I had rather speak 5 words with my understanding. All right. So that's the word "yet" that's involved there, is that he's saying, you say I should come with 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. On the contrary, I'm going to come to you with meaningful language as an interpretation of those tongues. He wasn't opposed to speaking with tongues. He was opposed, however, to them, that being the end of it, that there be no more than just that. He says it's got to have more content than that, especially when it's in the public assembly. Yet in the church. So the thing is that it's not that Paul was opposed to speaking 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. He qualifies that. He says, is he going to stop speaking in tongues? No, absolutely not. Would he speak 10,000 words in an unknown tongue outside the church? Absolutely. But he says, in the church, I had rather do this other thing along the way. So there's no doubt that he spoke 10,000 words in an unknown tongue probably every day. He wasn't saying, I'm not speaking in tongues anymore. He says, I'm going to just keep on speaking. But in the church, especially when you've called me to demonstrate how spiritual I am through speaking in tongues, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do that unless I get a chance to talk to you with my understanding along the way. Now, the word "I had rather" is a real weak translation of what Paul originally said in our Greek translation, where the word "I had rather" actually means I am determined. I am determined. In verse 6, the Corinthians would rather that Paul come to them speaking with tongues without any interpretation. That's what they wanted Paul to do. They were saying to him, we are determined that you come and speak with tongues to us. And Paul is saying, no. I am determined that I will come to you with revelation, knowledge, prophesying, and doctrine. Okay? In verse 19, Paul is determined to come to them speaking with his understanding, as it says there in this verse right here. I would rather speak 5 words of real substance. Okay? Now, this idea he's throwing out here, obviously, if he's going to speak to them by revelation and knowledge, prophesying and doctrine, is he going to use just 5 words? No, that's a pretty short teaching. I mean, those of us that teach are trying really hard to get more brief than we are because we're pretty wordy. But 5 words? No, don't take that literally. This is hyperbole that Paul is doing here. He's saying 5 words. He's just saying that I am going to make every word that I say of substance and real value. And that was at odds with what the current Corinthian culture wanted. You got to realize that the people he's writing to, they didn't like this thing about speaking briefly, each word having an impact and each word being important. No, the culture of their time was very flowery, long, dramatic speeches with hardly any content whatsoever. Oh, okay, better move on here. 5, thank you. Need a little help. So a few words of real substance was not what the Corinthians wanted. You know what they said about Paul when he said, I am determined to come to you and teach you with very few words of substance. You know what they said about that kind of style? They said, it's contemptible. They did not want Paul to come to them and speak briefly with solid impact, with every word being vital of importance along the way. What they preferred, and this is what is said by historians that have studied the rhetoric of Rome and Greece over the years, they said that their flowery speeches were to sway the crowd's emotions by the manipulation of words without substance. I've said before is that they even to this day we have on record famous speeches that were given by orators on the noble attributes of a flea and the disgusting appearance of a bald head. We've got them written this today. They were famous. These guys made a lot of money doing this kind of stuff. And here Paul comes along and says, nope, I'm going to speak briefly with vitally important information for you. I'm going to teach you with my understanding. I'm not going to just flap my lips to sway your emotions and impress you. I'm not going to do it. Okay, it's not to be taken literally. It's hyperbole. that he was working on there in this verse, with my understanding. Now, the word with in that phrase actually is through. So he's saying I will speak 5 words through my understanding. That's really an important little change there, because if I speak with my understanding, I'm speaking, and the source of the source of the information, the source of the communication that I'm giving you comes from me. Comes from me with my understanding. However, when it comes to the Word of God, and when it comes to teaching doctrine and prophesying and knowledge and those kinds of things, he's saying, I want to speak that my understanding is simply a channel of the real source of of what's being said here. My understanding is my thoughts. Paul used his intellect as a channel for what he communicated, which he communicated thoughts that originate from a source far greater and wiser than his own understanding. He was saying, I am not just imparting to you my opinion, my thoughts. I am giving to you the thoughts of God using my intellect as a channel. That's what we want to be doing when we're speaking. That's what we want to be doing when we're communicating all the time, is this thing is that people aren't simply encountering my understanding, but that my understanding is being used as a channel, as a conduit of God's understanding of the situation, God's understanding of what the Word of God says, God's understanding about prophesying, those things. So it's pretty interesting. That little word "with" is actually "through." There. And what he says in chapter 2 of 1 Corinthians is, he says, this is how he puts it when he's talking about his understanding being just a channel of those things that are coming from the Spirit of God. We speak not in words taught by human wisdom, but in those taught by the Spirit, combining spiritual thoughts with spiritual words. Once you start catching a hold of some of these things and realize that, hey, I don't want to give you my opinion. I want to give you God's opinion. I want to just use my intellect as a tool to get God's opinion to you. Once you start realizing that, you find out that Paul says it better than anybody else. Anyway, so, all right. That by my voice I might teach others. Now, teach means to instruct, to inform, to teach orally. In this particular Greek word of teach, it means to teach orally. In other words, this has to do with speaking, not simply writing, not simply art or anything like that. He's talking about that the conduit, the channel by which God's understanding is going to get to the people we are talking to is oral teaching. Some of the Corinthians did not believe that instruction, information, and teaching were the main uses of one's voice in a public assembly. In their culture, that was not the reason. I mean, we're looking at it and say, yeah, by my voice I may teach others. Yeah, what else are you going to do with your voice in the assembly of the church? You're going to teach. You're going to impart that which comes from God. And we're going, yeah, what's the deal there? Unless you're first century Corinthians. What Paul is saying to these guys is that they had a mindset that, hey, using my voice to teach is not the main reason to use my voice. They had other reasons for using their voice. First century Greco-Roman culture told them that the main use of one's voice was for the purpose of playing it to the crowd. This is again the quotation from guys who have studied Roman and Greek rhetoric. There's plenty recorded, so they got a lot to study. But they thought that one should use their voice to play to the crowd, to sway their emotions. They thought that when Paul used his voice to teach, it was contemptible. Now, the thing about it is that when we think of Greek and Roman drama where they would use their voices to sway the emotions of the people, we kind of have this idea that what they were doing is that they were bringing about some kind of empathy for the actors, that they would use their voices in such a way that that somebody would shed a tear for the poor damsel, and there would be some empathy, and there would be some cheering for the good guys and things like that. But in our day, and actually in their day as well, what we find out is that people are using their voices to sway the emotions of their hearers, and what the emotions that they're swaying, the emotions that they're hearing in, is outrage, anger, fear, fault finding. They're using their voices to stimulate these very dark emotions. And that has been the use. It was the Italians that came up with the idea of propaganda. That was to sway the emotions of the people toward outrage, anger, and fear. And that is one of the situations in our day as well. And Paul said, I'm not going to do it. I won't use my voice to do that kind of thing. Even if you think it's contemptible that I don't. What a disappointment, Paul. Wow, we're going to get a real speaker here tonight. You guys, you're in for a big show. He speaks briefly, and he teaches them. And then he's done. No riots, no snake dances, nothing. And they said, you're not an apostle. That's not what apostles do. So now we're to the phrase, I would rather teach others than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. Now, again, there are some teachers and or commentators of the scriptures that take this statement that 10,000 words in an unknown tongue and say, this is where Paul shows that he's really against speaking in tongues. Now he's been reasoning with them until this point, but now he's just laying it out and saying, I'm not going to speak in tongues anymore. I'm going to speak with my understanding, and that's all I'm going to do. But this is not the message of this verse here. Paul is not against speaking 10,000 words in tongues. He's against speaking 10,000 words in the church with the unreasonable expectation that this will somehow teach others without an accompanying interpretation. That's what he's against. He's not against speaking. He did speak in tongues, 10,000 words of it. Just think of all those miles. Just think of all those miles that he walked and walked and walked and walked and walked. I mean, he could have enlightening and stimulating dialogue with Silas or somebody along the way, but there's times, there's lots of times where all they were doing was they were just speaking in tongues. They were just praying. They were just meditating before the Lord as they were walking along. He had countless words in tongues outside the church. And of course, church means the public, open to all assembly. All right. Here's the last thing that I want to point out in this verse right here along the way is that he says 10,000 words. And the thing about words is that the Greek word there is logos. Most of us know that term. We might not know much Greek, but we know one Greek word, logos, or logos, and what that word means, it means something that is said that embodies an idea. Okay, I want you to notice that when he says 10,000 words in a unknown tongue, he's talking about something that is said in an unknown tongue that embodies an idea. This is the same word he uses at the beginning of the sentence where he says, I would speak 5 words with my understanding. Of course, we know that if he speaks 5 words with understanding, it embodies an idea. But the thing that we don't realize is that he uses exactly the same words to tell you what the content of speaking in tongues is. It embodies an idea. Every single word that is spoken in an unknown tongue embodies an idea. They are not gibberish, as some have said. They're not an uncontrollable torrent of unintelligible sounds, as others have said. Now, these are widely read guys that say that this is what tongues is. Paul says that it's logos. When you speak in tongues, you are speaking logos. Words that embody an idea. All right. Interpretation of tongues is the gift that transforms unintelligible sounds into words that embody an idea for the hearers. Okay? Obviously, you don't need an interpreter if you're just speaking in tongues to God. He that speaks in an unknown tongue speaks unto God. Okay? But if you're going to do that in the hearing of the assembly of the saints, come one, come all, every stripe, then there needs to be a translating of that and transforming of that from what they think or hear as unintelligible sounds, which they're not. The Scripture says they're not unintelligible gibberish. They are words that embody ideas. Excuse me. All right. Now, there is something that I'm going to digress for just a little bit on, and that is that, okay, for the last, from verse 6 until verse 19, Paul has been telling us this. He's been telling us that in order for a public assembly of the church to be edified by speaking in tongues, it must also be accompanied by interpretation of tongues. This requires a two-step process. Okay? The first step in that process is one must speak in tongues out loud in the assembly. But that's only the first step in the process. The second step in the process is one must speak out loud in the assembly a second time. You get that? One must then again speak to the assembly out loud a second time, giving a detailed explanation of one's understanding of what was spoken in tongues. Okay? That's interpretation of tongues. It's a two-step process involving addressing the assembly two times. Now, the question that must legitimately be asked, and this is a question that rolls around in the back of at least some that I know of, because they've written it in different places, and I've heard it expressed by people I know also, is that if speaking out loud in tongues in the assembly is going to result in edification for the church, by means of giving a detailed explanation of one's own understanding of what was spoken in tongues, okay? And that's what Paul says. It says, prophecy is greater than speaking in tongues unless, which means that speaking in tongues can have the same edification potential as prophecy, unless it is interpreted to the edification so the church can receive edifying. Okay? So there's this two-step process which makes speaking in tongues as edifying as prophecy to the church assembly. The question is if that's necessary and there's this two-step process in doing that, then why not simply skip the seemingly unnecessary first step of speaking out loud in tongues in the church? Why not just skip this speaking out loud in tongues in the church and go straight to the second step of giving a detailed explanation of what the Spirit has to say to the church by means of revelation, knowledge, prophesying, and doctrine? Why not simply go straight to speaking with the understanding and tell people in the language they all understand what the Spirit is saying to the church? Why not just skip the first messy first step? Most Christians have decided to skip the seemingly unnecessary first step of speaking in tongues out loud and go straight to the second step of giving a detailed explanation of what the Spirit has to say to the church. And they do that by way of teaching, testimonies, preaching, readings, lots of talk in the common language. Okay? That's what people, and the reasoning is, why mess around with this awkward and goofy first step. Let's just get on with it and not do this first seemingly unnecessary step along the way. All right. Hopefully you're following my drift here on this, because I think this is an important question that is kind of a sliver under the skin of many people about this speaking in tongues in the church thing. The honest answer to the two-step question, why the two-step process in order to edify the church? By the way, Paul assures us that if we will take the two-step process, the church will be edified. He says so right in verse 5. Says so. If you will take the two necessary steps, they will be edified. Well, the honest answer about why this two-step process with a seemingly unnecessary first step. I want to let you know that this is not an unusual and strange two-step process. I think most people think that this is just kind of an odd thing that just don't want to even think about it anymore because it's so odd. It doesn't fit with anything else in Christianity. But in fact, this is the typical and usual way that God provides for and deals with people. Scriptures are full of examples of God asking people to take seemingly unnecessary first steps that appear to have nothing to do with the desired end result. The thing that they desire, the thing that they need, the first step he asks of them has nothing to do with it. Over and over again, I'm going to just give you 6 examples. You could come up with 6 of your own because the scriptures are full of it. But let me just give you a few along the way here. In 1 Kings, you got Naaman the leper. Okay, and everybody knows the story there. And the thing about Naaman is that he had an expectation of what Elijah was supposed to ask him to do. He says, I thought that he would come out to me. Obviously, Elijah didn't even come out of his hut. I thought he would come out to me, and he would pray to his God, and he would call on the name of his God, and then he would clap all around the place. And then I would be healed. That's what Naaman thought needed to be done. So that's what he was expecting to have happen. Well, we know that he's just sent a message out, says go wash in the Jordan and everything. Okay. Naaman thought, this is ridiculous. I'm not doing it. What does washing in the Jordan have to do with my leprosy and getting healed from my leprosy? Washing Jordan, I would look ridiculous. I'd never live it down if I did that. Well, the thing about it is that if he did what Elijah told him to, he would be healed. If he decided, no, that's unnecessary. That's not necessary. It's an unnecessary first step. Okay. He would simply remain a leper. Okay. He would not be healed. Next one on my list is in John 9. Here's Jesus. We got this blind guy. Say, okay. So what does Jesus do? He spits on the ground. He goes and makes some mud out of and makes clay out of it, rubs it into his eyes. What does that have to do with anything to do with receiving sight? Absolutely unnecessary. Both Jesus and the blind guy looked like fools for doing it. But the thing about it is, if the blind man received what was being done to him and he actually participated in doing it, he would be healed. He would receive his sight. He could say, well, that's not necessary. It's just not necessary. I'm not doing it. No thanks. I'm not doing it. Well, then he would remain blind. That was just simply the consequence. Joshua, Israelites marched around Jericho, blowing trumpets and shouting. What does that have to do with knocking down walls of stone? Fortified city. Absolutely no connection, no logical, reasonable connection between what they desired, needed to have happen, and the first seemingly unnecessary step that they had to take. If they didn't take the step, the walls would remain. If they took the seemingly unnecessary step, first step, then the walls would come down. Okay? They had a choice. All of us have a choice in these things, and I think you can see my point here. I'm going to just go through the rest because I want to make sure that this is not unusual for God to require a seemingly unnecessary first step in order for us to get what we want. What do we want? We want the church to be edified. Then he says, okay, speak out loud in tongues. What does that have to do with the edification of the hearers? Well, are you going to do it or not? No, I'm not going to do it. Okay, then they won't be edified. See the point? Same thing happened, the seemingly unnecessary thing of taking handkerchiefs and aprons from Paul and giving them to sick people. It's not necessary. I mean, other times, Matthew 17, here's a real kicker. They needed to pay taxes. It doesn't give us any information about what kind of taxes this was that they needed to pay, but Jesus says, we got to pay taxes. Peter takes Peter, and he says to him, you got to do a 3-step process to get the taxes paid. Okay, Jesus, I'm ready to go. Who am I going to pickpocket? What am I going to do? Am I going to hit up my relatives? What are we going to do here? And Jesus says to him, take a hook. Take a hook and a line and go catch a fish with that hook and line. Wait a minute. I don't do hooks and lines. I'm a net guy. I'm a net guy. That's totally unnecessary. I don't do hooks and lines, I do nets. Okay, but catch a fish, and then in the mouth of this fish will be the coin you need to pay the taxes. What does all of these seemingly unnecessary first steps have to do with pay and taxes? The need was we need to pay the taxes. The unnecessary first steps was hook, line, fish. You guys, this is not unusual for God to require seemingly unnecessary first steps in order to gain the needed and desired result. In the last one, disciples were asked to give 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And what in the world was that going to do to feed 5,000 people? And we know the story about that too. That's only 5. You probably think of more than that along the way. But I just want to let you know is that this 2-step process that Paul lays out in many, many verses here is not unusual. Most of the churches said, that's weird. That's mentally unstable. And yet they all applaud these stories from the Bible and say, look at how wonderful their faith was. Look at how great God did things for them, and never realize that each situation is when they were asked to do something that seemed to be totally unnecessary in order to get to where they wanted to go. It's not unusual, it's typical. One thing in common, they all had to take that first step by obedient faith in order to get to the second step, which is what they needed in the first place. In the case of speaking in tongues, you've already seen it. The desired outcome is the edification of the church. The seemingly unnecessary step is this speaking out loud in tongues in the assembly by obedient faith. Did Naaman think he was going to look like a fool? Yes. Okay? Here's Peter skulking around with a hook and a line amongst all these seasoned fishermen who knew the only way to make a living at this was with nets. And he's trying to hide this. I'll look like a fool. How am I going to explain this? Hook and line. And all these other things that we could talk about in here, that they all had a choice. Am I going to do this thing in obedient faith, or am I not going to do this thing and not receive? Wow. Okay, now we're at verse 20. Brethren, be not children in understanding, howbeit in malice be ye children, but in understanding be men. Many who just read this superficially and lightly suddenly think that Paul has changed subjects here, that he's done talking about speaking in tongues and interpretation and those things. And now he's moving on to talk to them about giving them fatherly advice about mature thinking, but thinking more maturely. But I want to tell you is that Paul is not done with the subject of speaking in tongues. This admonition is in the context of the last 13 verses that were all about speaking in tongues and interpretation of tongues. He's not done with it. He's not changing subject and giving fatherly advice about mature thinking in general. Instead, he is admonishing the Corinthians who he's writing to think maturely, specifically about the subject at hand, which is speaking in tongues. Many commentators have believed that after all these verses in which Paul is supporting speaking in tongues with interpretation and how this can be edifying to the church, that suddenly he's turning around and saying, oh, but speaking in tongues is childish, and you should stop doing it. You should grow up. One very famous Bible teacher these days, his interpretation of this verse right here is simply this: not to criticize him, but to tell you what the mindset of many who are reading and studying these things is. A lot of times, this guy says that after everything that he said about speaking in tongues and everything, he concludes by saying that speaking in tongues is really a kind of childish ostentation. Ostentation means show off. It's that speaking in tongues is just a childish ostentation. And he misses the point by a long ways. He does understand that verse 20 still is talking about speaking in tongues, but he concludes that speaking in tongues itself is a childish thing to do, whereas what Paul is after is that he's against the childish understanding about speaking in tongues that the Corinthians have, and he will get to that in verse 21 and 22 as we go along in this. He's not changing subjects. He's specifically talking about speaking in tongues, and he's resuming his argument against the Corinthians' childish request that he come to them speaking in tongues. He's still refuting this thing that said that, and he's saying there's something really childish about this understanding about speaking of tongues you have. This commentator, he misunderstood and said, speaking in tongues is childish. No, Paul is not saying that speaking in tongues is childish. He's saying that your understanding, your practices and beliefs about speaking in tongues are childish. Not the tongues itself, but the way you do it is childish. And he's going to give very good examples of that childish thinking in the next two verses. But we got to get through this verse first of all. Be not children. You need to realize that Paul has just tactfully told the Corinthians that they're babies. In the kindest, gentlest possible ways, thinking your understanding of these grace expressions that the Spirit has given is your thinking about them is really childish. And he's going to dismantle their childish thinking in the next few verses along the way. But it's a chewy section along the way. He will hasten to provide clear proof of how childish their thinking is in the next two verses. Okay. Be not children in understanding. Now, here's the interesting thing, and I've talked about it a little bit at different times, but Paul has about 4 different choices of Greek words that he could use that has been translated understanding. And I'm not going to go into the other Greek words that Paul normally uses for when he's talking about the understanding, my understanding, man's understanding, God's understanding. There's several words. He uses a word that he doesn't use any place else in the scriptures. Just in this one place and a couple other places where he uses the adjective form of this noun in a couple other places. But this is the only place where he uses this Greek word phrein. Phrein. It says, "Be not children in your phrein." Phrein is a noun. It literally means your midriff, your belly, your diaphragm, your gut. That's what the word means. Wow, that should get some curiosity up. Why does he use this word when he had a whole bunch of other perfectly good words to use if he meant something else? Figuratively, that's the literal meaning of it. Figuratively, when he uses the word phrein, it means your inner attitudes, your disposition, your frame of mind. Now, notice that it doesn't say your mind. It says your frame of mind, the framework in which you think. He's talking about something that's just a little bit harder for people to understand, is that we think in certain ways, and we realize that the source of that is our brains. We've taken in information, we have synthesized that in some way, and we think in a certain way. But there is a framework around the thinking that when our thinking gets to the point where it bumps into the framework, guess what? We don't go any further. We can't expand beyond that into something new because we've already got an inner attitude. We've developed an inner attitude. We've had a whole life of experiences and teaching and relationships that have influenced us and given us an attitude. And it's like it bought this inner attitude that we've been building and assimilating and collecting is kind of prisoned us in to the point where we can only think so far. And when we bump into the walls of our attitudes, the walls of our experiences, the walls of what we've been taught and things, when we bump into those walls, we don't go any further. We stop. And that has to do with this word phrein, is that phrein, a couple of places where he uses a description of this phrein is in Ephesians. He says, the spirit of your mind. Notice he doesn't say your mind. He says the spirit of your mind. There's something deeper. There's something more profound and far-reaching than your mind. It's the spirit of your mind. It's an attitude you have that your mind is limited to. And other places in Romans 12, the renewing of your mind, where he's saying this limited way of thinking has to be broken through, and he calls it the renewing of the mind, where, no, we're going to revamp this. We're going to dismantle the frame of mind that you've all lived in, and you're still building that attitude about life and about other people and about God and about Scripture and about everything. He's going to revamp. He's going to dismantle, and he's going to renew the way you think. Wow, that is a huge undertaking that Paul just stuck his foot in here when he says, you're childish in your attitudes. You're childish in this framework that you've built around you. Another way that it could be said is that this frame of mind, and it's a use that's common in our day, is the lens through which we view life. We have been developing lenses, just like, corrective lenses, but the lenses that we have developed are all distorted. They're all distorted. We live in a fallen world. There is things we've done, and there's things that have been done to us. There's teaching and things that that have developed a lens from which we look through that that makes things distorted. And the Corinthians had this problem. We all have this problem, and we will take up renewing of these lenses that Paul takes the Corinthians through.